So if we sort of wind back the clock a few years.
Yeah,
we
more than a few, unfortunately.
Well, we go back to a younger Ryan Dancey.
Yeah.
So a Ryan Dancey who's just entering the gaming industry.
Yeah.
What your first job was it the Isomedia, and then you moved into Five Rings Publishing? How did that come about? How did you go, what did you do? Go from college into?
Yeah. So I had a child younger than all of my friends did.
Right.
And when my daughter Tila was born, we were the only couple in our circle of friends who had a child.
Right.
So we suddenly became the wet blanket for everybody's social activities. And I was brainstorming things that I could do with her that would not be totally disruptive and kind of kill the fun. And I talked to my buddy who I was co-founding a tech startup with, and I said, hey, we should get back into playing Dungeons & Dragons like we did in high school.
Sure.
Because you can take a toddler to a D&D game, put her in a playpen, and she's right there. It's harmless, right? Well, we had both previously worked at a company called the Mac Zone, which is a PC and Macintosh hardware and software reseller.
Right.
This is before the internet, so they did catalogs and mail order. And so we had this whole idea about how you bought things at distributors at substantial discounts from retail merchants. So we thought we would set up a fake mail order company and use the fake mail order company to get a distribution contract so we could buy all of our D&D supplies at 50% off of retail.
How did that work?
Unfortunately, or extremely fortunately, depending on how you look at it, it was very fortunate in my case, our fake mail order company turned out to be a real mail order company. And it turned out that there were actually a lot of people who wanted to buy stuff that they didn't have a local retail store.
Right.
This was kind of my first introduction to the fact that there are a lot of gamers who don't have the luxury of a really good full-line game store that's relatively convenient to them.
Yeah.
And at the time, this is again before the internet really took off, there was no Amazon, there was no Paizo.com, there was no place to buy this stuff. So we provided a really valuable service. And I wanted to run advertisements for that company in industry magazines. And at the time it was Dungeon & Dragon, that's where we started. And then kind of what next? And White Dwarf is a house organ for Games Workshop. They don't take ads from anybody. And I found this little magazine called Shadis Magazine. And they were kind of new and hip and indie, and like they had a lot of street cred. And people I knew that were kind of really into kind of the hardcore gaming, they were like, oh, the Shadis Magazine is really cool. So I contacted them, and that's how I met John Zinser, who's still is the CEO of PG.
Yeah.
So this is our 20-year anniversary. I came to Gen Con in 1994 for the first time, and one of the reasons I came to the show was to meet John and to work out the details of our advertising. And I was the only person I think in Milwaukee that weekend who was wearing a suit. And I walked into the exhibit hall, and I've got my suit and tie on and my briefcase loaded with all my negotiating papers, and it's Gen Con. And man, did I stick out like a sore thumb.
Yeah.
I mean, today people would probably think it was the Holocaust.
Shorts and And you're not a short man as well. So
yeah, I'm pretty easy to see. Yeah. So I went into the exhibit hall, and I tracked down the Shadis booth, and I met John. And John, he reached across this table and through this crowd of gamers, and grabbed me by the hand, and he pulled me into the gaming industry. And it was just a whirlwind from then on out. He made sure that we got to all the right parties and we met all the right people. We spent a lot of time at the Safe House. And that was the year that trading card games had really exploded. So Magic was released in '93, and '94 was the release of Jihad, which was their Vampire the Masquerade license. And it seemed like every booth that we went to had a trading card game, and they were not great. They had been rushed out because people wanted to capitalize on the wave, and it takes 6-8 months to make a game. And so these are really games people had basically made. Like, I saw Magic at Gen Con in '93, I made a game, I printed it.
Yes.
So we were sitting at a table at the Safe House, myself, John Zinser, Dave Say, who was John's partner at the time, Dave Williams was there, my partner Steve Milton, who's my partner at my tech company, and I'm pretty sure that DJ Trindle was there, but I'm not 100% sure. And we kind of looked at each other and said, we could do as well as these guys are doing, and we probably could do a better job. And so we all kind of shook hands and said, let's make a trading card game. And that was like the great adventure. We made Legend of the Five Rings. We brought that game to Gen Con in '95 in a preview set. We made a 100-card sheet with enough cards to make 2 playable decks, and we showed up at that year's Gen Con. We're like, we're doing it. We're making a trading card game. And that was kind of my conversion from a fake mail order retailer that turned into a real mail order company to being a game publisher.
Right. Sure.
But the problem was that we ran that business as a joint venture, and joint ventures in America have very strange corporate tax issues, and there are a lot of weird issues that make joint ventures just kind of suck. And we were all really good friends. So we said, look, let's just cut through all this. Let's start a brand new company, and our company will pool its ownership of Legend of the Five Rings. John's company will pool John's interest in Legend of the Five Rings into this new entity.
The Five Rings Publishing.
And that was Five Rings Publishing Group, right? That's how that got started. So, when I say we, in this case, I mean me, we're young and arrogant. And we thought we had solved the problem of how to make trading card games. And my idea at the time was we would do a whole set of games with different genres and different licenses to kind of capitalize on this model that we had built for Legend of the Five Rings. And we never thought we could make a game as big as Magic, but we thought maybe we could make 10 games that are each 1/10 as big as Magic, right? We can aggregately create a really large publishing juggernaut, right? And we attempted to do that. We produced a ton of games. But all along the way, everybody that was involved in the project had kind of in the back of their minds the same thought, which is Wizards of the Coast should just buy us. We're local to them. They were in the Seattle area. We were in the Seattle area. The Five Rings Publishing Company is in the Seattle area.
And I assume you knew the people involved at the time.
Yeah,
so
I've known Peter for years. Knew him before there was a Magic the Gathering. So there was a really nice kind of wouldn't it be great if we all got together kind of thing. And we came very close once. We had some serious discussions about whether or not that made strategic sense, and that deal just didn't happen. And later in that time period, we kind of got wind that TSR was having problems.
Yeah, so I was going to ask you about that. How do you end up brokering a deal? You're not part of either company at that time. So how does that happen? Yeah,
so my father always taught me that luck is when opportunity meets preparedness.
Okay.
We got very lucky, which means we were prepared to exploit an opportunity. So TSR was outwardly a very well-managed company. They always hit their deadlines. In an industry that's notorious for people who miss shipping dates, they, like clockwork, would ship many books every month of the year on time. And they were of relatively high quality, so they didn't just throw anything in a box and ship it. And in the fall of 1996 and the spring of 1997, it became obvious that there was a problem when they started to miss shipping dates.
Yes.
And then Dungeon and Dragon magazine missed a ship date, which essentially had never happened in
I remember that well.
20 years or so, right? It was a big deal. Okay, so purely by coincidence, the guy that we had hired to be the CEO of Five Rings Publishing Group was a guy named Bob Abramowitz. And Bob is kind of a wheeler-dealer, really good at personal relationships, knows a lot of people in a lot of different fields of life. He raised a lot of money for Five Rings Publishing, which was one of the reasons he was the CEO. And weirdly, one of his first jobs out of college was working in the sales department at TSR. He was there for like a summer, selling stuff back in the battle days when they had like a knitting company, all this weird stuff you may have read about on the internet. So he kind of tangentially knew a person who knew a person who knew a person who knew Lorraine Williams, who was the CEO and the largest shareholder at TSR. So Bob, who is a very smooth, pleasant, charismatic guy, gets on the phone with her and essentially sweet talks her into letting us come out and take a look at the business. And Bob knows nothing about hobby gaming, right? He's a pure business guy. He knows how business works. He doesn't know anything about gaming. So he and I flew out to Lake Geneva, and we went to TSR. And it was pretty tough. The company was really in distress. They had really hidden a lot of how bad things had gotten from the outside world. The staff was very worried. They didn't know if they would come to work and be locked out of the building. I mean, it was truly a company in crisis.
You've written about this on the internet more than once.
Yeah.
It sounds from what you've written in the past that you were shocked by what you saw.
I was shocked.
You were aware there was a problem, but were you aware it was quite that severe?
I mean, I'm an entrepreneur, and I think entrepreneurs are optimistic by nature, and so I had a hard time imagining it could be as bad as it was. But we were there for a reason.
Sure.
There was no way Lorraine was going to have us come and talk to her about this topic unless she had a big problem. So, I mean, I was prepared to see that there was a problem. I wasn't prepared for how bad the problem really had become.
Yeah.
Right? And the output of that meeting and a couple of follow-on trips out there is that Bob and Lorraine agreed that for a certain price, TSR could be acquired. And we represented to Lorraine that we had a reasonable chance of arranging financing for that deal, and that we would get back to her within some amount of time, 30 days I think it was.
But had you spoken to Peter at all at that point about that?
No. You know, I think Bob and I both knew that Peter was going to be the answer to the problem of how does this get funded. Yeah. And so when I was very fortunate, I inducted Peter to the Adventure Gaming Hall of Fame. And at his induction speech, I told the story of the $1 Million Facts. So we had all these trading card games we were producing, which I mentioned before. We thought we could make, you know, 10 games that were 1/10 the size of Magic. That's really expensive. And we had in fact spent ourselves in something of a hole. We were probably nowhere as deep in that hole as TSR was, but we were in a hole. And so we got back from these meetings with this agreement from Lorraine to buy the company for a certain price. And Bob calls up Peter and he says, I want you to lend me $1 million. And Peter says, there is nothing on earth that would compel me to loan you $1 million. So Bob says, what's your fax number? Back in the day, faxes. So we faxed over the cover letter of the term sheet we had negotiated with Lorraine, which said, without naming a price or a date, that the purpose of the term, the deal sheet, was to buy TSR. Fax that to Peter. About 10 minutes goes by, the phone rings. Peter says, can we have a cashier check in your office in a week? That's fine, Peter, send that money right over. You know, and then Wizards immediately engaged. Like they took that deal over in an instant, and it was a very good deal for 5 Wings Publishing. They agreed to acquire us at the same time they acquired TSR. Yeah. That was kind of the price to get access to our deal. But Peter and I like each other a lot, and I think we have a lot of the same strategic ideas about things. Sure. And frankly, I think Wizards should have bought us earlier than that anyway. So it really wasn't a negative to Wizards that they ended up buying 5 Wings Publishing. It was positive for everybody, you know, kind of all along. And you know, Peter went out to Lake Geneva and was able to convince Lorraine that it was time and that he was the right person to make the transition with. And you know, the board at Wizards was very supportive of Peter and did what they needed to do to make the capital happen. And the next thing I know, I worked for Wizards of the Coast, and Dungeons and Dragons is in the building.
And that must have been a dream come true.
Oh my God. Yes. So, yes. I am one of the very few people you will probably meet who ever actually did the thing they wanted to do when they were 12 years old.
Right.
I wanted to publish Dungeons and Dragons when I was 12 years old, and I have published Dungeons and Dragons.
I wanted to be an astronaut.
Yeah, well...
I still do, to be
fair. They can still happen, you know. Elon Musk took $1 million to ride the Spaceship One, right? I think 500,000. You know, this web thing can work out for you, I don't know. Yeah, so it was absolutely a dream come true. And I love Dungeons and Dragons, and I love everything about it, and I came to love the people that work on it. You know, some of them are my very best friends today, and the fan community that you enter when you become a part of the Dungeons and Dragons world is unbelievably awesome. So it was my privilege to be involved in that. I never looked at it as anything other than I was extremely fortunate, and it was so cool. So at the time, Peter took over the running of the business day to day, and Bill Slavisek was appointed essentially to be in charge of the R&D department. Yeah. But you know, Peter has a whole company to run. And so by the end of that first year, Peter made the decision that he needed to step away from a day-to-day operational role, and he trusted my judgment and trusted my vision, and asked if I would be willing to take on the business half of that task, Bill running the gaming half, to which I immediately said yes. And so late in 1998, I believe, I took that job over, and I became the head of the tabletop RPG business unit in the Dungeons and Dragons brand manager.
When I first heard of you, I think.
Could be.
I mean, that was partly when the internet was getting big, and
yeah,
you know, sites like Eric Noah's site was springing up and things like that.
Yeah.
Your name was popping up and things.
Yeah.
But did you have a plan at that point how you were going to save? Well, not save to yourself, but how are you going to fix that problem?
No, I didn't. Well, that's not really true. So, as a part of the acquisition, we had roughed out a strategy for what needed to be done. Like making an addition to Dungeons and Dragons, that was obvious. What does that addition look like? What does it cost? All those variables, that really wasn't in the plan. So one of the big problems we found at TSR was that there was a big disconnect between the designers and the business people. And the designers were never told what it cost to make any of the things that they created. And as time had gone on, they had started to make products that literally cost more to make than they made when they were sold.
Which does sound like a mistake.
Yes, yeah, you cannot make that business work.
No.
So fixing that problem was obvious. Like, we want to make the costs make sense. Sure. Charge what should be charged, not make a product that costs too much.
Was there an issue perhaps of product lines being split into like, I mean, how many different settings there were?
Yes.
12 different settings,
Yes.
and of course no one's going to buy 12 settings.
Yes, yes, that was so obvious to me. Like, you splinter your fan community across all these little individual slices, and it's hard to remember now, right? This is, what are we talking, close to 15 years ago? Longer than that. TSR's annual catalog in 1996, let's say, probably had 150 tabletop role-playing game releases in it.
Wow.
Like, they would release 5 to 10 things a month, right? And the ability to buy and consume that content is beyond anything the market could bear. And what was happening was each new release in a line would sell less than the previous product because people still hadn't had time to digest the thing that they bought, last month.
And of course things get ever more specific as well.
Yeah, focus gets narrower and narrower and narrower. Okay. So one of the luxuries I had at Wizards is that because TSR had catastrophically failed, we were enabled to make radical changes.
Right.
If TSR had only been slightly messed up, we would have been required to make slight changes, right? But it was a complete smoking crater in the desert. And at that point, what's to lose, right? You might as well try the Wahoo crazy stuff because 10% here or there
can't get any worse.
Not going to fix it. Yeah. So, so Wizards is and was, and I assume still is, a very data-driven company, and we wanted to make decisions based on good data, not just Wahoo crazy what we think are the right things to do. And Lisa Stevens was attached to the business team at that point as our business analyst. And so she started to produce a lot of spreadsheets and inventory analysis and cost analysis. We had an excellent market research team at Wizards of the Coast. They began to produce pretty good data on what people were doing with the stuff we were selling. And all of that began to congeal around this idea that immediately we had to stop the bleeding by substantially reducing the number of things we were producing. And I make this joke all the time that it's better to sell 7 units of one thing than to sell 5 units of 2 different things. It seems like it shouldn't be, but the way business works, it is. So we ruthlessly cut into the schedule. And there were some casualties. There were some really good ideas for products that didn't get produced, even though they may have been all the way through design and were ready to be printed, just because they became non-strategic. And that's painful. Creative people hate to see their work go to waste. And I hate to see work go to waste. But it was kind of the right thing to do, for the business. They had 3 role-playing games. They had Dungeons & Dragons, Alternity, the Saga system. I'm probably forgetting 1 or 2 other things. That doesn't make any sense. So, we got to wind these other lines of business down. You can't just go out on day 1 and say we're cutting it cold because you're really damaging retailers who are carrying a lot of inventory, distributors carrying a lot of inventory, and players who become vested in a game system. You're essentially telling them they're out of luck. That sucks.
Edition changes don't tend to go down well, do they?
Yeah, not at all. Well, edition changes is tough. Try imagine just whacking a whole game system.
True.
That's no fun. So by the end of 1999, I think we had all the pieces in place to start making really good decisions. We knew we were going to have 3rd edition. We roughly knew what 3rd edition was going to be. We had some ideas on how to sell it. We had gotten the business back to profitability, mostly by just stopping making a bunch of stuff that didn't make any sense. I think the community was losing the fear that some of them had that we were going to turn Dungeons & Dragons into a Magic expansion.
You still say that sometimes.
I know they do. It's been 15 years. Time to let that go. And so we started to turn our attention to how are we going to sell the 3rd edition of Dungeons & Dragons, right? And Keith Strom, who was the business manager working on my team, one of the things that he observed really early on was that our biggest competition wasn't Vampire the Masquerade, it wasn't GURPS, it wasn't Rifts, it was another edition of Dungeons & Dragons. There were more people playing earlier editions of D&D than there were playing any other role-playing game. That was our actual competition. We needed to come up with a way to induce those people to upgrade, to make a transition through the edition change. If we failed to do that, it wouldn't matter what else we did. The game wouldn't wouldn't have any traction. And that was kind of the genesis of like, how do we get these people who are playing, you know, original D&D, basic D&D, AD&D first edition, AD&D second edition, right? I mean, there was a whole tree of product out there. Forgotten Realms, Dragonlance, Mystara, blah, 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 on and on and on. How do we get them all to kind of come home to the mothership? Because we don't have time or the interest in making a conversion product for every campaign setting, a conversion product for every edition of D&D. Like, all the little corner cases and strange things people had cooked up down through the years, all of which had some people playing them and were vested in them, right? And, you know, eventually we just struck on this idea of saying, look, let's just not make that stuff. Let's let the community make that stuff. Let's empower people to unleash their creativity and plug all the holes in the giant
things that it's not worth you making.
Absolutely, right? And, you know, the analysis we had coming in from Lisa was, look, the core books is where all the profit is. Eventually you start making these supplements and nobody buys them and they don't make any money. So, you know, focus on making core books. Focus on making a small number of really good adventures. Focus on making tools that people can use in their own games to make their own campaigns and, you know, do the stuff they want to do. Let's put our guys on that. We have the best RPG designers in the world. Let's make the stuff that really has high impact. So then the next question is, what are the terms going to be? You know, if somebody comes to you and says, "Hey, I want to make a supplement for your game," you know, what's the royalty rate? What's the approval process?
I spoke to Monty Kirk a couple of months ago in an interview. He mentioned that at first you were the person pushing the OGL, and even like the designers like himself didn't understand at the time why should we give away our game system?
Yeah.
And it was largely down to you, you know, pushing the idea.
I tell people I was in the room when the magic happened.
Right.
You know, kind of my job was to be a cheerleader and to move that ball down the field. You know, the open gaming license was something I believed in very, very, very strongly, and there had certainly been foundations built for that idea at Wizards of the Coast. People don't remember this, but one of the very first products Wizards of the Coast ever made was a thing called the Primal Order.
I remember that.
And the back of the Primal Order has conversion nodes to use the Primal Order with a whole variety of game systems. And it is the opinion, and still is today, of the publishers in the hobby gaming business that you require a license in order to make a product that is compatible with their game system.
Yeah.
Whether you believe that's true or not is irrelevant. The industry believes that is true, and that is the standard operating regime. As a part of the Primal Order project, the people that were around Peter at the time, they created or envisioned a thing called Envoy, which was supposed to essentially be a compatibility or translation layer. So you could convert out of a game system into Envoy, and then out of Envoy into another game system.
Okay.
You create like an intermediate layer between two games.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the idea that there should be this kind of ability to use other people's mechanics predated my arrival at Wizards of the Coast. I think that one of the reasons that we were successful was that this was something that Peter had been thinking about for a long time.
Right.
He may not have thought about it in terms of like creating an open license mimicking some of the software licenses, but the overall idea that, you know, there was something here which should be free for everybody to use without a huge, you know, overhead of royalties and approvals and all that stuff. That was part of Wizards' DNA from early on.
So was there any resistance at all to the idea at first?
Oh my God. Yeah, a lot of resistance.
I mean, you say Peter already was thinking on those lines, so presumably it didn't mainly come from him.
No, it didn't come from him at all, and that's why the open gaming license happened.
Right.
Because the people that were most upset about it would go to Peter to complain, and
right.
Peter would shut them down. If Peter had the slightest doubt about the open gaming license, it would not have happened. Like, big American companies don't take risks, right? That's just dumb, and it was a huge risk. So it really required leadership from the very top to happen. There were a lot of people in the company who, okay, so let's say there was a certain group of people who said, we don't want to lose control. Yeah. That was their first issue. Like, we want to own this brand, we want to express it the way we want to express it. We don't want to see stuff published that we don't like. You know, it's about control, yeah. Right? That was one group of people. Then there was another group of people saying, this is done from a business perspective. Like, every one of those products gets made is going to be money that we could have made. Why aren't we making that money? Why are we letting somebody else, you know, earn that money?
Presumably your response is, those are products we can't make money on.
Yeah, yeah.
Whereas a small company maybe can.
Yeah, yeah. So, you know, we kind of shucked and jived on the first question, and hey, look at the monkey, and maybe they'll be okay. But on the second question, I think we had a really good answer. It's like, we don't want to make those products. That is the stuff that really damaged TSR. It's not, we don't want to damage Wizards of the Coast like that.
Exactly.
And then I think it dawned on a few people that they could be those people. They could make their own products, and they could be tapping into the D&D network, right? And so maybe a few people that originally were really against it quietly came around to the idea. Maybe there was a little something there for them, right? Okay, that was good. There were a lot of thought leaders inside Wizards who had to be convinced. They started off very negative, and we showed them our data and made our business case and talked about other things like how it works in software. We didn't have to invent this concept. We borrowed it from the software world to show that, like, you can have this thing where there's a company that makes a product, and then there's a bunch of other people who make products that are related to it. You're not hurting the value of the primary company, right? And at the same time, Wizards was getting pretty deeply into retail stores. They had originally started 4 or 5 stores for a whole host of good strategic reasons. And then they bought a company called Gamekeeper that had 50 or 60 stores. So suddenly they're in the business of having a lot of retail stores. And there was a guy who worked at Wizards at the time. His name was Scaff Elias. He was one of the very early R&D guys who worked with Richard on Magic. And Scaff says in a meeting one day, look, the reason we own retail stores is because we want every kind of game to sell better. Because we are the market share leaders in trading card games and in tabletop role-playing games. And every time there's a success in one of those categories, our products sell better.
Yeah.
It's a situation where a rising tide lifts all boats, but it lifts the biggest boat more. So the only thing that's going to happen if a bunch of people take our intellectual property and go make really great products is we're going to sell more Dungeons and Dragons.
Okay.
So we like to call that the Scaff effect, to kind of encapsulate this whole business idea of, like, it's totally okay if a bunch of people go out and make really successful products, because eventually the result of that will be people will play more D&D. And our new business of 3rd edition is selling core rulebooks. And you don't sell the core rulebook to somebody again, you sell it to them once.
So jumping ahead, so that's the theory. So you go ahead a couple of years, you've done this.
Yeah.
I mean, looking back, you can now say, yes, that definitely 100% worked.
Okay.
How much of a success was that?
Yeah, I absolutely say it would work. Okay, so we have some data. So I left Wizards of the Coast at the end of 2000, early part of 2001. Yeah. And the wave of 3rd edition was still rising at that time. So I don't have official numbers about what happened afterwards. I wasn't there for 3.5. So I can speculate, but I don't actually know. Okay, but this is what I know. In 1989, when TSR made the transition from 1st edition to 2nd edition, they sold 286,000 copies of the Player's Handbook in the year of that transition. Okay. When we transitioned from 2nd edition to 3rd edition, we sold 300,000 copies of Player's Handbook in 1 month. And it got better from there, okay? So I think that success was not because of the open gaming license, and not because of D20, and not because we fixed the RPGA, and not because we had a better relationship with our community, and not because Wizards of the Coast had good marketing. It was all of those things working together as part of a cohesive plan, right? So, I think that we had a lot of objectives for the open gaming license at Wizards. We wanted to see great new products get made, and a lot of really great products got made. We wanted to see new talent enter the industry. The people who make tabletop role-playing games at the time were aging. A lot of them had been in that business for 20 plus years, and they were getting ready to move on and do something else. And there wasn't a huge cadre of people coming up behind them to replace them. Open gaming created that cadre. Mike Merles is one of those people, right? The guy who went to the new edition.
He came up in the OJ with that.
He's one of those guys, right? We wanted to explore design spaces that our existing designers wouldn't explore. Sometimes when you don't know you can't do something, you try it and you find out that you can. And so empowering a lot of people to just try to do cool stuff meant a lot of really cool stuff.
They can take those risks, like if someone was working in space.
Exactly.
It's a risk, but Wizards doesn't have to take that risk.
That's right. Right. So the one thing that I think Wizards didn't succeed on, unfortunately, is the idea that they could pull in from all that cool open content that's being created and take the very best of that stuff and merge it into Dungeons and Dragons, and advance the Dungeons and Dragons game by using the best of the best, right? To me, that's the truly open ecosystem, where Wizards opens D&D, and then Wizards brings back D&D.
Nobody's done that.
That hasn't happened.
Paizo don't do that either.
No, it really hasn't happened. And you know, I'm sure there's a million reasons why it hasn't. But that's kind of the last major step to that has yet to really happen, right? Is that true feedback loop? If you look at something like Linux or Apache or any of the open source software projects, right, they're all driven by bringing that stuff back in. And until that really starts to happen, I think that there is an unfulfilled promise at the heart of open gaming. You know, another problem we had at the time, and people forget this, but the role-playing game industry was in crisis. It wasn't just CSR, it was brutal. Role-playing game companies were dropping like flies, and nobody was making very much money in that space at all. And a lot of really talented designers and publishers that had been around for a long time were going out of business for a whole variety of reasons. You know, and one of the things that we believed, again, when I say we in this case, I mean me, was that there were so many different game systems and so many different ways to play role-playing games that people were getting subdivided in these little niche markets. And if the niche collapsed, you lost all the people. You didn't just lose one person, you lost that whole gaming group, or maybe a club, or whatever, a fairly large group. And we wanted, and one of the reasons, in my opinion, was that the industry did have this, it does have this opinion that you have to license access to game engines for each other. And so every guy with a great idea for a game made a whole new game instead of just taking what was great from an existing game and making a new version of that game. So every single publisher had their own house system, right? And you know, I know this term is a little bit loaded, but there's this concept of the fantasy heartbreaker, where it's such a great idea in this one little narrow area, but you have to make a whole game, and the rest of it isn't very good, right? You nailed spell casting or combat or whatever, but you know, that's not a game, that's a feature of the game. And then you had to go do all the rest. You know this, you've done your own game. And you know, it's a lot of work to make a complete role-playing game.
And not all of it you want to do either. You know, you're focused on that bit that,
So, you know, at the time, I thought one of the effects of open gaming is it'll collapse that function. Instead of people always saying, I have to make a new game from scratch, they could take an off-the-shelf game and just change the part of it that they wanted to make better. And the advantage would be that they wouldn't have to sell the whole game, they could just sell the part that they changed. And it makes the marketing very easy for them. And it's easy to attract players to something who want that thing. Like, I want realistic spell casting or whatever. Like, okay, well, here's the game that does that. And oh, by the way, you don't have to learn how to play it because you already know how to play it. You know, and at the time, we got a lot of criticism, and I got a lot of criticism for the idea that this was like anti-competitive, or it was bad, it was evil. Like, we're taking creativity out of the world, all these great games.
Yeah, I mean, there was certainly a sentiment from some areas where it was like, okay, everything's going to become 20 now. There will be no other games. Of course, that didn't happen.
No, and I never thought it would. You know, that's a comment that's often attributed to me that I never made. I never thought there would be only one game. I always thought there would be fewer games, and I thought the games that would survive would be the ones that had really strong player networks. The World of Darkness games, Rifts, GURPS. Like the games that we all know are successful, that D20 and open gaming wasn't going to affect them. They had really good player networks. It was going to affect all these games you've never heard of because they're gone, right? Well, the thing that was really interesting in hindsight is, at the same time that we were kind of collapsing the function of gaming, of role-playing gaming, kind of in the market, there was this rise of the indie games, the stuff that was coming out of the Forge, right? And these were really divergent games. These weren't fantasy heartbreakers in the classic sense of I changed one little thing and then kind of all the rest wasn't great. These were games that no one had ever made ever before. They were wildly divergent. So at the same time that maybe the diversity in the mass market, I don't know if I want to use that word, the larger market for role-playing games was declining under the pressure of the open gaming license, in a different segment of a different market, there was an explosion of creativity as people were trying out, you know, all these new ideas in gaming. You know, those games, they don't have large unit volumes, and a lot of them aren't very big. They're 50 or 75 or 100 page books. So the rate at which they can be created and expressed and kind of adopted and then moved on from is very, very high. And I hope, I like to believe that it was a synergistic process where at the same time people were getting really focused on Dungeons and Dragons, a different group of people were getting focused on doing wildly divergent things, and they would meet in the middle and cross-pollinate, right? I think that has happened to some degree. You know, I don't necessarily think it happened as much as some people of that time thought it would happen, but I think it has happened somewhat, right?
But I think Mike Mills had some sort of forged roots, didn't he, 10, 15 years ago?
Yep. Yeah. I mean, so Luke Crane is the guy who makes a game called The Burning Wheel. And based on what the numbers I can see, I would say Luke is probably the most successful publisher of role-playing games to come along as a totally fresh startup company with its own game system in a very long time, right? I know that Fate does really well for Evil Hat and Fred Hicks, and they may be close to comparable. But I mean, I think that Luke is probably that guy. If Luke had come to our industry before 1993 or 1994, Luke would have been the next guy in the line that includes Steve Jackson, Kevin Sembita, and Peter Atkinson. Yeah. He would have started his own game company. He would have produced a successful line of tabletop role-playing games, and then diversified into whatever caught his fancy. But he came after there was this structural collapse in role-playing, which was not a result of open gaming. It was a whole bunch of factors that are very complicated. And as a result, like, Luke is the most successful person of his generation, but it didn't happen for him. And there may not be anybody, again, in that tradition that goes all the way back to Gary and Dave.
Yeah,
you know? But, you know, Luke made some really great games. Burning Wheel, Burning Empires, Mouse Guard, Torchbearer. These are fantastic products. And I like to think that the work that he and his friends and his peer group have done will affect the larger, you know, more mainline. I'm trying to avoid, I mean, we're talking about a very small market, so it's like, I can't really say it's like mass market like Monopoly, but more of that stuff is going to come into, you know, D&D and World of Darkness and that kind of stuff. That kind of ideas about narration and storytelling and empowering players and really interesting systems for how you modify the game environment as you play. You know, that's all kind of from that indie RPG movement that Luke is kind of the product of. And I love seeing that stuff, you know, start to appear.
And of course things like Kickstarter and things like that help facilitate that to a massive extent.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Kickstarter has been a reboot. It's totally, okay, so 4 or 5 years ago at Gen Con, Gen Con used to do like an industry day the day before Gen Con, and you could go and hear people lecture on various topics related to publishing. And Peter Atkinson did one of those panels one year, and he had Q&A at the end, and I asked him, I said, hey, do you think that you could raise money today to start a role-playing game company? And he said, no, I don't think it can be done. And then he asked me, do you think you can do that? And I said, no, I don't think it can be done. It can totally be done. Like, it's back as well. Yeah. So like, the door was closed, and the door's open again. So, and it's open to anybody, and who knows what's going to walk through that door. You know, Magic was a shock to everybody. There's no reason there couldn't be an RPG shock.
How these things sort of seem to happen periodically.
Yeah.
I mean, there was the OGL which you were involved with, which I think is one of those things.
Yeah.
Kickstarter is certainly one of those things.
Yep.
I think I've heard you mention that just something like desktop publishing was one of those things, like many years ago.
Yep, absolutely.
But, and you know, who knows what the next one might be in 5, 10 years' time.
Yeah, absolutely.
So these things sort of happen on maybe not cyclic, but on a periodical basis.
Yeah. And sometimes like when we most need them. The coincidences are startling.
Yeah. So going back to the OGL, I think I've also heard you mention that aside from the sort of business benefits to it and the business arguments for it, there's a sort of moral was the wrong word, but a more altruistic argument in that you can put D&D out there and then you know it can't be brought back by, I think the phrase you use is capricious with its grace, or something like that. Like, that might not be the exact words, but
pretty close to something I probably said.
Something like that. And that obviously is true in Pathfinder and things like that. Which, I mean, was that definitely in your mind at the time?
Yes. So, hobby game publishing companies have very little assets in the traditional sense. We don't buy factories and real estate and tooling.
Yeah, it's all IP.
It's intellectual property, right? TSR, when it ran into problems, borrowed money. And the security that they pledged against the money they borrowed was the copyright interest in Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
And they borrowed money from several different banks, and they had sliced the copyright interests up pretty thinly. Various different books and various different things had different copyright interests. And had TSR actually gone into bankruptcy, I believe it's very likely there would not be a Dungeons and Dragons being published. Or if it was published, it would be something radically different than what it is. Because the banks, who couldn't have cared less about Dungeons and Dragons, they would have fought over the value of those rights, and then they would have probably auctioned them or had some process for somebody to buy them, and who knows who could have ended up owning them, right? Just look at the D&D movie rights. They're
it's a mess.
It's a cluster. So, you know, one of the thoughts I had with open gaming license was, while we're doing good for Wizards of the Coast, and I 100% believe that we were, we can also do something that says that this thing that we love transcends corporate ownership and will survive in the form that we are giving it forever, right? No company can ever screw this up again. And I like Wizards of the Coast and I like Hasbro, and I'm not in any way trying to say that I think they're bad stewards. I'm just saying it's just off the table. It can't happen. There will be, you know, Dungeons & Dragons is now Shakespeare. It will be with humanity forever. And that is, you know, awesome. Like, good for everybody. I don't think it hurts Wizards of the Coast a penny that's true.
So even if, you know, Paizo suddenly decided tomorrow, they won't, but if they did, suddenly decided, hey, we're not going to do that anymore, we're just going to do, I don't know, golden plushy toys and card games. And Wizards moved on into a radically different system and didn't open up 5th edition at all. That's still there.
Somebody can pick it up.
And, you know, I could just, you know, run a Kickstarter and say, okay, I'm going to do D&D. Not D&D, but, you know, something
I mean,
3.75. In
the early days of the open gaming license, you know, there were people who basically took the system reference document, put art in it, and published it. They thought there was a business to be made selling the same book I was selling.
I
don't think they did very well. But
what's the feeling behind that? I mean, from Wizards' point, was that after you left? Was it
for what?
When certain companies started releasing basically SRD with art.
No, I think I think you could have bought one of those products in the fall of 2000.
Did that bother you guys?
No, it didn't. And we planned for that. So when we decided the pricing for the core rule books for 3rd edition, we set them at $20. And we could do that because we were going to print in quantities that no other company in gaming published. And they would be full color, hardback books. The Player's Handbook came with a CD with a character creator on it for $20, right? The best that our competition could do would be to publish something around $20 that would be on very low quality paper in black and white softcover. So what's the value proposition if you're a customer? You can buy the actual Dungeons & Dragons book that has the actual Dungeons & Dragons logo on it.
You can buy this crappy ripoff, which,
yeah, exactly. Now, I think there is a whole nother thing you could do, which is you could have made a really super high-end value product. Like, the thing I actually was kind of wondering if somebody was going to do was like, do a $100 Player's Handbook. Leather-bound, gilt-edged.
A couple of people went the opposite way and tried to produce, you know, tiny ones
as
well, didn't they?
Oh, that was a whole different ball.
It's really what you can do is just mess with the format.
I was on a big crusade. One of the last things I did when I was at Wizards was I was on a crusade to say we've done a really good job now of exploiting the low cost end of the market. Now we need to really target the high end of the market, right? So when I was at Wizards, I had this dream like I want to make a $100 product, and I mean that just sounds like nothing now, but this is 2000, and that was unheard of. When we priced the Forgotten Realms campaign setting book at $40, the person who was in charge of sales for Wizards of the Coast came to my office and said, because you set that price point, you are going to sell half as many books as you would have sold. Is that $10 really worth it? And I said, I think you're wrong. And oh, by the way, here's the math, and yes, it's totally worth it. Even if we only sold half as many, it's $10 of profit, right? It's totally worth it. $40 did not turn out to be a significant price differentiator. And today there's lots of books sold at 40, 50, 60 bucks. But, that $100 product to me was always this kind of mythical number. It's like, man, if I could sell a product for $100, it could be awesome. And I could do so much cool stuff, in a product for $100. And I understand that there's a smaller market for that than there is for a $20 Player's Handbook. And I understand that there are people that are going to look at that and feel like, I can't buy that. I don't live in a world where I have $100 to spend on a gaming product. But in reality, a lot of people have $100 to spend on it, right? And we all kind of know that now. that's going to become obvious. But this is
even
15 years ago.
Say they haven't often have.
Yeah, and since then there have been a couple of $100 products. AEG did a book, World's Largest Dungeon, that was $100, and Monty did a book called
Totus.
Yes, the Totus book, which was $100. But man, I'm still waiting for somebody to really. So I'll tell you, we had this idea. I wanted to make the ultimate Dungeons and Dragons, and the ultimate Dungeons and Dragons was you sent us a description of the people who played in your group, and we re-illustrated all the core rulebooks with iconic characters that were your characters.
Wow. Okay.
Right? And we would make a Dungeon Master screen that was your characters in an adventure.
Bespoke Dungeons and Dragons.
Yes. And I mean, I don't even know what it would cost, right? But there's some number of people out there who would pay that, right?
Yeah.
And at various price points, like, somebody famous would write an adventure for your group.
This sounds like Kickstarter pledge levels.
Now you could totally, exactly. Now there's like a way to do this, right? But kind of the high end of the comic market has been explored. There's a lot of really high end special publications. There's certainly a lot of high end figurines and statuettes and props and all that stuff. There is a market there and people are exploring that.
Yeah, well, there's a high end of everything.
Yeah, that's right. But there's not really a high end for tabletop role playing games. Like if you went over to the exhibit hall and tried to buy the most expensive tabletop RPG product that was a game, not a table or something, you probably couldn't spend more than $100.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah.
Maybe buy some like rare, collectible thing.
Yeah.
But like produced for sale today, nobody really goes and sees what's out there. And I think that would be a fun place to go and innovate. So maybe someday.
So you went, working on D&D was a dream come true.
Yep.
But you weren't there for that long.
No, I mean,
was that disappointing to be moving on and
it was
after such a short time?
It was a challenging time for me at Wizards of the Coast. So when I went to work at Wizards of the Coast, they had an all-hands meeting, and the entire company gathered, and it was about 200 people. That was in 1997.
Yeah.
In 2000, there were more than 2,500 employees at Wizards of the Coast, and the company was in retail and was doing Pokemon. And the company was vastly bigger in every dimension than it was just a few years earlier.
Because I think Mike Mills recently said there are approximately 15 people currently working on D&D.
Okay.
How many people back then were working on D&D? I think that's excluding retail people and all and licensing and brand management. Actually working on D&D.
There's a lot more than 15 people.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just going to mentally begin to kind of run through my list of who I know. So there was probably 30 people in RPG R&D.
Yeah.
There were at least 10 people on my brand and business team. The art was a little bit different because there were some in-house artists and then a lot of freelancers.
Yeah.
But there was still a very large art support team. There's at least 10 people minimum in art. 4 or 5 people doing marketing. And now I'm not even counting like accountants, support staff. I'm not even counting those people, right? It was a much, much, much larger team, than 15 people. Well, it was a much bigger business then too. I mean, like I said, I don't work for Wizards. I don't know what their numbers are, but I would guesstimate that the Dungeons and Dragons business at Wizards of the Coast today is probably a third the size it was when I was there. And I'm purely speculating. I don't know.
Okay. So, you moved on from there and you went to work for CCP. Was that directly from there?
No. I started it. So in the fall of 2000, I knew that my exit at Wizards was rapidly approaching. The company didn't have a great place for me anymore, and I didn't feel like there was a lot more that I could do with Dungeons and Dragons. And I really wanted to promote my leads into more senior positions, and there weren't any, so I created one by exiting. I started a company called Organized Play.
Oh, of course. Yes.
And the idea behind Organized Play was that we were going to create the tools that Wizards had built for trading card games and role-playing games and make them available to any company that wanted to use them.
Yeah.
And I ran that company for a couple of years, and then I had a consulting company, and I was on a consulting deal in Las Vegas, and I got a phone call from a recruiter who asked if I would be interested in taking a job in Reykjavik, Iceland. And apparently I'm one of the few people who said yes to that question.
Was I surprised you? I mean, going from D&D to working on an MMO?
I knew that my transition was eventually going to lead me to MMOs.
Right.
You know, I view tabletop and MMO as a continuum of the same thing. To me, they're not two different businesses. It's just an evolution from where tabletop was to where MMOs are going. So I have always been kind of keeping an eye on the MMO space and trying to do as much as I could to be employable if the opportunity arose. And that opportunity happened because of Mike Tinney. White Wolf had been acquired by CCP the year before, and Mike was on their leadership team. Mike was the president of White Wolf, and they needed to hire somebody to come and run their marketing department. And Mike insisted that they consider me as a candidate, and got me, got my foot in the door. And I owe him for that. It was great. I mean, he bootstrapped me into the MMO business. So, and CCP was the exact right company for me to go to. They were small enough where I could have an impact. They had a lot of strategic questions to answer, and I had a role in answering those questions. If I went to work for Blizzard, I'd be a cog in a giant machine. I couldn't do much. The things that I do best, I couldn't really do. So being at CCP was fantastic.
Sure.
It was a perfect match for like where I was in my life and what the opportunity was.
Yeah.
And I learned a lot there. The people who founded that company are still running it. So I got to hear all about how they started Eve, and grew it from nothing to what it is today, from the people who did that work. It wasn't like handed down. TSR, nobody who started TSR was there. Well, Kim Mohan was there, but he didn't start. He was there a long time. Everybody else was.
Was that kind of a learning experience for you in that you could then take that to move on to Golden Works?
Exactly.
And what's the Pathfinder thing?
Yeah, I jokingly say that I learned the lessons of what happened to CCP better than the people who run CCP.
Right. Okay.
Right. I mean, I like to think that I heard all of the really important stuff and am able to apply those lessons, and I hope I can apply those lessons in the MMO space.
Right.
Whereas they're struggling a little bit. So
sure.
Yeah.
So you exit CCP.
Yeah.
And do you have this idea for Pathfinder Online at that point? Was it Pathfinder specifically, or was it an MMO?
No, the first thing I did was I wanted to see what options were out there. So I contacted a bunch of MMO companies to see what their interest was in hiring me. And I did a bunch of interviews, and I looked at a lot of products, and I didn't really find anything that I thought was really a strong match. And so I called Lisa, and I said, Lisa's the CEO of Classic Publishing, and I said, hey, what is your strategy for online gaming with Pathfinder? She says, well, we have a strategy to have a strategy. Why don't you come explain it to us? Okay. And I wanted to do a sandbox game. So I think the business of MMOs right now is really badly broken. The games that most people are familiar with are financially unsustainable. In the industry, they're called AAA, which means the best of the best, and they're theme park games, which are a lot like World of Warcraft. And the tail end of the era of those games is on us. And at the tail end, those games cost between $100 and $200 million, and they take 7 to 10 years to develop. They take a 1,000-person team to get built, and they have not so far shown a return on that level of commitment that is commensurate with the risk that is being taken. Right. So as a result, there are no AAA MMOs in development today. Nobody is making another one. Okay. So I knew in 2010 that something needed to change, and there needed to be a new business model to make this make sense. And when I went to talk to Lisa about making a Pathfinder Online, my initial pitch was, let's do a $50 million game. We'll have a 300-person team, and it'll take 5 years. Okay. Right? Oh, I'm so radical. I'm half the money, right? 75% of the time. And she challenged me. She said, look, I heard all your analysis, and I think it's all true. Why are you coming to me with this idea for a $50 million game? I mean, it's not that much less than $100 million. How small can it really be, right? And I'm like, oh, I don't know. I had a fairly complicated business model that I built, and I sat over a long weekend, and I just chopped and chopped and chopped, and it didn't make any sense. And the more I chopped, the less viable the business made. We were having to cut functionality and features and not generating additional revenue. Right. And so we were just losing more money faster, right, on paper. But then something magical happened, and like I cut so deeply that I got to the point where I'm like, well, heck, like if we make this really small game, even though we'll appeal to a relatively small audience, on paper it pencils out and it starts to be profitable really quickly. And the beauty of an MMO is it's a service, not a product. So once it's profitable and self-sustaining, it can invest in itself to get better over time. you don't have to rely on investors, you don't have to rely on capital, you just rely on revenues from the customers, right? And so I think we found a sweet spot where we can make an MMO for a very small budget with a very small team on a very fast timeline, and we can get this thing to market and use the revenue to create all the rest of the stuff that will come, you know, online in the next couple of years. And that de-risks the plan substantially. You know, one of the big concerns that Lisa had was, if I do a license for Pathfinder Online and the rights are tied up for 10 years and you fail, I've lost 10 years of time to find a better partner. So if we can do this on a really accelerated timeline and you fail, I've got all that time back to try again, find the next partner.
Well, first you've got to find $50 million.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, right. Yeah.
So you launched Kickstarter for $1 million. Which is, what was the tech demo, wasn't it?
Yeah. So our first Kickstarter was, we had a $50,000 goal.
Yeah.
We wanted to build a technology demo, which is essentially a vertical slice. $50,000.
I don't remember. Wow.
Yeah, we raised $307,000, which was awesome. And so the vertical slice was, it's not a game, but it's everything that you have to make a game. So we could go to an investor and say, look, this is a legitimate effort. These people we are hiring, they can do the graphics, they can do the networking, they can do the programming, right? This isn't actually a game, but it looks like a game and it shows we can do all the game things. And we didn't necessarily think that we would do a second Kickstarter, but that year Kickstarter just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and we all kind of looked at each other and said, man, we'd be dumb to not ask the community to back us again, because it gives us freedom. Like, I don't have to answer to an investor somewhere. Like, the first dollar in came from the public, and I always can hold that up and say I have to do right by my customers. I can't just do something because you want to follow the trend of the day, or whatever you saw in the newspaper. It's like, nope. The people who backed that Kickstarter are the people I'm working for. They put their money in before you did, so they are the people who have the most impact on what we do. And then we made so many mistakes. Anybody out there doing a Kickstarter, don't do a Kickstarter at Christmas. It ruins your Christmas. Like, my family is like, Ryan, what is wrong with you? I'm like, I'm Kickstarting. I'm so stressed. I don't
like doing it. I honestly,
it was nuts.
There are moments when it's exhilarating, but the bits where it's not, the whole world, it's too much.
You know, I think we asked for too much money. I had this whole philosophy that I had to tell people how much money we had to raise in order to make a meaningful change in our business plan, which was to accelerate development, right? So it was going to cost us $1 million. I can't move the needle very much with $100 grand. I had to get enough money to get a bunch of extra people and move a lot faster. In retrospect, I don't think we had to have an analysis entity. We could have said we're trying to raise $100,000. We could have asked for a different number and been hitting stretch goals, and the tempo of the campaign wouldn't have been, oh my God, are they going to make it? It would have been, they made it easily. How much bigger can it get?
I think on advice I've heard and I've passed on is that setting your goal low is always a good idea, because you have to hit that we have funded thing as early as possible, even if it's not really what you really need. As long as you can do something.
I learned a lot in that. A lot that I passed on to other people. So I learned the lesson, so you don't have to.
So Goblin Works has been developing Pathfinder Online for what, 2 years?
I mean, we essentially started the tech demo in midsummer of 2012. We began work on the actual game in the January timeframe of 2013.
And that's all sort of going to schedule, I take it, all going on. So what's the reaction, because you've got alpha playtesters, you've got things like that, what's the feedback been?
It's been awesome. Okay, so in order to play in our alpha, with no questions asked, it costs $1,000. And if you charge people $1,000 for something, they're probably going to like it.
And people have?
We sold 90 some odd alpha accounts.
Wow.
There were some in the Kickstarter, the first Kickstarter, and some in the second Kickstarter, and some have bought since then. But it's awesome, because they're so excited about it, and they are predisposed to have a good experience. And then when they play, and they enjoy what they are playing, and they do, everybody who comes in after them comes into an environment where everybody's having fun. It's upbeat, it's a positive thing. It's like, how cool is this today, right? You set that tone from the very first day.
You created your own sort of...
They're like super evangelists.
Sort of thing.
It's fantastic.
I mean, you describe it as a sandbox game. Now, I'm not totally clear what you mean by that. What is a sandbox game in terms of an MMO?
Okay. So we see there's being two kinds of MMOs. Theme park games are games like World of Warcraft and its clones. And in a theme park game, the primary mode of interaction is between the player characters and the environment. And a theme park game is called a theme park game because you do the content over and over and over again. Like you go to the theme park, go to Disneyland, and you ride Space Mountain 100 times.
Yes.
Right? Well, if you're playing World of Warcraft, you go to a raid and you do that exact same raid over and over and over again. Okay. So that's a theme park game. In a sandbox game, the primary mode of interaction is players interacting with other players. And the players create their own content through those interactions. So a theme park game is all about content. I have to make the theme park. Yeah. A sandbox game is all about systems. I create interesting ways for players to interact with each other. Right. And coincident with the fact that theme park games cost too much, making systems is a lot cheaper than making content. The other problem that theme park games have is that you finish them. You can do all the content, and there are many people who don't want to do the same raid, week after week after week. They do it all and they're done, right? Well, in a sandbox game, there's no end game. The players are the content. The players interacting with each other creates the content, and humans are infinitely interesting.
Let's give me an example.
Yeah, sure. So, sandbox games typically have very detailed economies. They have you harvest resources, you craft them, and then you use the things that you craft. Theme park games, you typically don't use a lot of things that are crafted. Most of the gear you have are things you got from the environment. They're not things built by other people. So, in a sandbox game, there's a harvesting game where you have to figure out where the best resources are and go get them. Then there's a crafting game where you have to acquire the resources at the lowest price, craft based on what the market wants, extract profit from the crafting. People will pay you for in-game currency for the stuff you're crafting. So you can get into feedback, like earn money to buy resources to make money. Okay, and then at every point along that process, there's an opportunity for conflict. The conflict is not always combat, but humans conflict each other all the time. So conflict could be when I'm in the wilderness and harvesting resources, people try to stop me by killing my character or blocking my access to that resource. Or maybe they try to ambush my caravan and take my goods from me.
So, but I've never played Eve, but from what I hear, that sounds like Eve.
Yeah.
Is that
the Eve does that in space.
That's the same model, isn't it?
Yeah. But you could also have conflict, for example, where let's say I want to sell +1 magic daggers. And based on my skills and abilities and my social context, everything I do in the game, it costs me 100 gold pieces to make a magic dagger. So I can't sell my magic dagger for any less than 100 gold pieces, or I can't make any money. Yeah. Maybe you are a much more advanced character, or you have a better social context, or you found better resources, and you can produce that dagger for 99 gold pieces. You can create conflict with me by pricing your dagger at a price I can't make a profit. Exactly. Right. And then you take that, which is basically individuals, and then you blow it up, and it creates, it's social. It's like me and 100 of my friends are trying to make daggers, and you and 100 of your friends are trying to make daggers. And we have this giant network of interconnected points of conflict where we can derive some meaningful interaction from. That's sandbox.
So is there larger scale world building elements to it as well?
Yeah, so yes and no. We have so our plan is to begin with what we call minimum viable product, which is a small feature set that makes sense to make, and then grow over time. So we have a design document that has wild and crazy stuff in it that we never get to talk about. It's in there, right? Relatively quickly, you will be able to go to places on the map and build structures which are persistent, and other people can interact with them and see them, and they will have a meaningful effect on shaping the world. In the midterm, you'll be able to build whole settlements, which are like little forts, and they have lots of structures inside them. And the people who run those settlements will make choices about the buildings that are constructed and the resources that are consumed. Right? In the very long range, in the far future, I have this vision of the module store, which is like the app store, and you have a toolkit, and you can make you can make content, and it's a little bit like a theme park, and sell it, and we'll split the revenue with you, just like Apple splits the revenue in iTunes, right? So, in the distant future, there could be the sandbox which we build, and then interesting theme park content which people who are really good at making adventures could build. And then you as a player could pay to access that, and the people who made it would generate revenue. They have a job being adventure designers in the far future.
I've just learned something about it. I think you just clarified in my mind what Pathfinder Online is for the first time, because I've always been a little slightly confused about what you were doing there. So no, that sounds really interesting.
Pathfinder Online is a game about exploration, adventure, domination, and development.
Yeah, no, I think it was that sandbox phrase which was confusing me, and there's sudden link to Eve in my mind. So suddenly
connected the dots.
Suddenly clicked it. That sounds fascinating.
I don't want to say that it's Eve with swords, but we respect Eve and learned a lot from Eve. And we would like to continue the tradition of great sandboxes that Eve started.
No, that sounds fascinating. So from the Pathfinder point of view, I suppose. I mean, obviously you don't work for. But presumably that's going to be part of their sort of overall, like Wizards are doing, overall branding kind of expansion. So that is that. I mean, from your point of view, would you say that's a general theme at the moment with some of the larger companies, that they are definitely trying to expand? You know.
Yeah.
Because they're all doing comics, they're doing toys, they're all doing Legos or mini figs or whatever those things are, plushies and movies, if that happens, and they've always done novels and stuff. So I mean, in this sort of like mid to long term future of RPGs, is the brand going to be the thing rather than the game?
I think that Paizo is going to be a tabletop RPG centric company as long as Paizo exists. That's their DNA. Their success with the adventure card game might mean that they have two strands of DNA.
Yeah.
But the card game and the tabletop role-playing game are similar enough products that the people who work on them they can move back and forth between those two teams. The skill sets and things you do for a video game are completely different. Same thing with like a movie production. Plush toys, right? So things which are outside of Paizo's core competency, Paizo is smartly saying, we either need to find a partner or make a partner to do that work. Paizo has always been very conscious of the value of their intellectual property. And partly that's because of their experience with Wizards of the Coast. When they were a licensor for Dungeons & Dragons magazine, everything they made was owned by Wizards of the Coast. The copyright was all owned by Wizards.
And when that was taken away, they had a crisis.
Well, yeah, I mean, yes, there was a crisis, but also, you know, Lisa knows how much money she spent on art for covers and content for magazines, none of which she owns. Now, that wasn't a surprise. I'm not trying to imply this was a shock, right? But, you know, they ran those magazines for 2 or 3 or 4 years, I don't know how long it was, and at the end of the day, they didn't own any of it. And they know how much money they spent on it. So, I mean, at the heart of that company is the knowledge of how much money they spent on somebody else's intellectual property. So, building their own brand, their own intellectual property, is just what they want to do.
It's common sense.
Absolutely. And they have done a fantastic job of it. I mean, Pathfinder is very well positioned, it's very clean, it's very easy to understand. There's not a lot of bizarre stuff going on in there. There's not a lot of holdovers from previous, you know, regimes of management or whatever. It's the same team that built it, is still running it. And they're doing a great job of making products that people who like Pathfinder will like. They're not going to make products that they think their core customer would find non-interesting. Like, they want people to be happy at the fact that they're doing video games, plush toys, and comics, right? It's all good. Like, it's Pathfinder. It's awesome for everybody, right? It's not like, oh, comic books are terrible. We're doing one anyway, you know. So yeah, they're great about managing that brand, and they're in a very weird place, right? They're the first company in the history of the industry to ever outsell Dungeons and Dragons. No one's ever been here before. So the stuff that D&D has been doing for years, Paizo is doing some of that stuff too, but they're not doing it just because they want to copy what TSR and Wizards of the Coast did with D&D. They're doing it because it's the right thing to do with the Pathfinder intellectual property.
Yeah. I mean, you say that outselling D&D, and obviously we're all aware of the ICV2 bandings and things like that, which aren't gospel. But, you know, people sort of talk about DDI subscriptions, Dungeons & Dragons Insider subscriptions for D&D, which obviously aren't counted in these things, and all sorts of things. And of course, for the last 2 years, Wizards hasn't really produced
publishing anything. Exactly, right. So it's not hard to outsell it.
To be fair, not outselling, it would be an embarrassment to an extent. I mean, do you think that's going to continue? Do you think?
You know,
I mean, I'm not asking you to predict the future. It's just a.
I think there has been a change. I think that Pathfinder is now the flagship brand in the tabletop category. I think the SCAF effect now applies to Pathfinder. And D&D has given up structural things which will be very hard to get back. there used to be a Dungeons and Dragons section in major bookstores, and they don't have that anymore.
Right.
It's either a role-playing section, or in some cases it's a Pathfinder section. The RPGA used to be very large and very active in retail stores, and that has almost been completely replaced with the Pathfinder Society. So, saying nothing about the quality of Dungeons and Dragons, the structural issues that Wizards has to either recapture or rebuild, very, very, very difficult. And Paizo is not going to sit back and let them do it without fighting back. Paizo is going to fight to keep their position.
Sure.
So Wizards doesn't have the luxury that Paizo had of not having to fight an active opponent, right? It'll be a struggle. I actually think that's good for everybody. You know, if Wizards and Paizo really go at it, you know, knife and tong, everybody's going to see cool promotions and great products.
Oh yeah, of course.
It'll be awesome.
It's going to
it's good for everybody.
It's going to force both of them to bring their A game.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's what's bad for the consumer.
And we the customers get.
Exactly. But you know, my intuition tells me that that Paizo has moved into new territory now, and I think they're positioned to hold on to it, and we'll just have to let time see what occurs, right?
I think there's maybe a danger of, at some point, Paizo getting into that area of over-specialisation and narrowing the focus, at which point they're going to have to relaunch. And of course Wizards are relaunching right now, and obviously have an awful lot of attention at the moment. I mean, that's going to factor in some way, presumably.
It's a bigger challenge for Paizo than it is for Wizards right now, because Pathfinder's core value proposition for its launch was just keep playing 3.5. Right? I mean, at the end of the day, that was the pitch. And so, how do you take a brand that is based on don't change and then tell people now you have to change? Right? That is a transition that nobody knows how to make.
Exactly.
Right? And if and when it happens, you know, it'll be all new ground.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's what I've been wondering for quite a while. Where can they go?
Yeah. But you know,
they don't need to right now. But
it's weird. Like when we did the 3.0 plan, we assumed there would be a 4th edition in 10 years. It had been roughly 10 years from 1st to 2nd, it had been roughly 10 years from 2nd to 3rd. We just assumed that there was some natural pacing, that there would have to be a new edition of Dungeons & Dragons, you know, 10 years after 3rd edition. And 3.5 and Pathfinder, which is very close to 3.5, have now been going for more than 10 years. So maybe that's not so true anymore. Maybe we don't. Maybe the industry and the players don't have to have a major you know, major engine transition. Now I have to say I have not played any of the new version of Dungeons & Dragons yet. I read the basic D&D.
The 5e version.
The 5e version, I don't know what they're calling. I'm trying to use the right term. There's no 5e.
We can just say 5e.
Okay.
Then we know what we mean.
All right, 5e. I would say that 5th edition is much closer to 3rd edition than it is to 4th edition.
I personally think it's closer to 2nd edition.
Okay.
That's my feeling from it.
Okay. So I think maybe Wizards kind of agrees that there doesn't need to be a major engine transition. Like, they've got a pretty good game engine, and they don't need to make major radical changes, right? So, bully for everybody.
Well, you kind of get the sense from them that this is the last edition that they plan on making. I mean, who knows, the regime changes frequently over there, so, you know, different people will be making decisions in 10 years' time, but... You know, that seems to be the feeling I'm getting at the moment.
I'm actually surprised they made another edition. I think I may be even on record somewhere saying I think 4th edition is going to be the last edition of D&D. Like, why does Hasbro want to keep making new editions of Dungeons & Dragons? Make a really great edition and just publish that for a long time. And then make movies and video games and novels and everything else that's going to come down the pike. You know, the old era of where you had to make a new game engine, it may be passing. It may be all about content now. Like, can you write great adventures with your game engine? Maybe that's more important.
Mastered that. I mean, that is central to their...
Paizo's got it in spades. They're turning those adventure paths into their own brands. I mean, their Rise of the Rune Lords, which was their first big adventure path, that is becoming a thing, totally separate from Pathfinder.
Well, it's like Wizards Forgotten Realms, for example, isn't it?
That's a whole campaign setting. I mean, Paizo did it with a story, which is pretty impressive.
I think Wizards are trying that with their Tyranny of Dragons.
Yeah, sure they are.
And things like that. We're going to see a lot more of that. There's something called Princes of the Apocalypse coming next year.
Okay.
Something like that. I can't remember.
That sounds awesome. So, I like dragons, I like apocalypses. Way to go, Mike. Make it happen.
Well, anyway, I think we should start wrapping this up. Because we're going for, what, an hour and a half maybe.
It feels like
time just flies.
Feels like nothing.
And we do have dinner engagements.
Oh, yes, sure.
So it's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, it was fantastic. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
And we're going to have to do this again sometime.
It would be great. Anytime.
That would be fantastic.
I'd love to return to the EN World Studio.
That would be, yeah. Studio as it is.
Yeah, it will be as plush as this.
Yeah, this is upscale. Yeah.